Hello, today I'll be talking about poultry litter incineration as a source of energy. I'm going to review the potential for impacts on environmental health and environmental injustice. First, I'm going to give a background of using poultry litter as a renewable energy. Then I'm going to review some of the emissions from the incinerator and how that translates into exposures and health effects for the surrounding communities. Finally, I'll discuss some potential agricultural and other impacts of these incinerators on their surrounding communities. So to start, what is poultry litter? The picture here is of an industrial poultry operation. You can see there are a lot of animals in a small space. What you can't see is that they're standing basically on a bed of wood chips and shavings, and that gets periodically cleaned out, and that is what poultry litter is. It consists of manure, that bedding, which is wood chips and shavings, feathers, and spilled feed. As I'll talk about later, it can also be supplemented with wood or other fuels, and that is so it can reach the desired moisture level in order to burn most efficiently. The idea of using poultry litter as a fuel for incinerators first started in the United Kingdom in 1993. They were constructed to deal with the excess amount of poultry litter due to industrial poultry operations. Before this time, poultry litter was used primarily as a fertilizer because it's very rich in nitrogen, and this was seen as an alternative to land application and specifically over-application on certain lands. Currently, there are 5 large-scale poultry litter incinerators worldwide, 1 in the US and 4 in the United Kingdom. This slide shows a brief schematic of how you use poultry litter to create electricity. So it starts out arriving in covered trucks where it gets placed in a fuel hall. Basically, that's just a large building where the poultry litter is stored and can be mixed with some of those other ingredients like wood, like I was talking about before, that can bring it to the desired moisture level. The fuel hall is supposed to be controlled using negative pressure. And what that means is that the air is sort of sucked into the hall and fed into the furnace, and that is so odors don't escape. And so that's how it should work. The fuel then goes into the furnace and is burned. As it burns, it heats up water in a boiler, creating steam. And then that steam powers a turbine, which creates electricity. It's similar to any other combustion-based incinerator. The byproducts are then the dust and acid gases from the furnace, and so those are removed to varying degrees depending upon the pollution controls in the baghouse. And anything that's not removed in the baghouse goes out the stack. So this slide says that's mainly steam, but that really is dependent upon the pollution controls in the baghouse. The other byproduct is ash, either great ash directly from the furnace, or fly ash from the baghouse. Now that ash has lost all of its nitrogen. So if you recall before, I talked about how poultry litter is very rich in nitrogen, which is what makes it such a great land fertilizer. Once you burn it, the nitrogen is lost into the air, but it is still rich in phosphorus. So that can be used as a fertilizer if what you require is phosphorus. In North Carolina, what our Department of Environment and Natural Resources did was they wanted to compare emissions between different types of fuel in incinerators. So the last column is poultry litter, and the other 4 columns are new wood, new coal, and existing biomass. And it is comparing different pollutants. As you can see when you look at this table, poultry litter creates more pollution, more pounds per hour, based on a 50 megawatt boiler than new coal in almost every pollutant, except for sulfur dioxide, in which poultry litter is lower, but it's very, very close to new coal. So in terms of its ability to reduce pollution, it really doesn't have that ability. It's pretty similar to to other existing technologies. It's also important to note that the source of emissions are not just the smokestack. It's estimated that about 100 trucks per day filled with litter are needed to power these types of incinerators. And so that's primarily diesel trucks contributing to particulate matter and other pollutants in the ambient air. Additionally, as you can see in the picture on the right, these trucks need to be washed after dumping off the litter with biodisinfectants. And so where that water is drained and where that wastewater goes can have an impact on surrounding communities. Now I'm going to talk more specifically about the emissions and their associated health effects that can arise from a poultry litter incinerator. One primary pollutant is particulate matter. Particulate matter are tiny dust-like particles that are released into the air. The composition really depends upon the process which produces these little particles. So if it's burning of the litter, which are the particles that would come out of the smokestack, or the particles that would come out of the exhaust of the diesel trucks. Those would have different compositions and could have slightly different health effects. In general, particulate matter tends to consist of a lot of different components, and that could include dust, soot, smoke, metals, as well as organic materials. And I have on the slide just a small schematic of a diesel particle, which is, as I said, just one type of particulate matter. Certain populations are much more susceptible to the health effects of particulate matter, and they include the elderly, young children, pregnant women and the developing fetus, and people with pre-existing medical conditions, things like heart disease, diabetes, and asthma. There has been a lot of research into the health effects of particulate matter. They tend to, the two major ones tend to be both respiratory as well as cardiovascular. So for respiratory, I'm talking about among people who have asthma, they're more likely to have an attack if they're exposed to particulate matter, more likely to have wheezing symptoms, decreased lung function. Some studies have shown an impact on lung development in children, the development of chronic bronchitis, as well as irritation of eyes, nose, and throat in the general population. Some of the cardiovascular effects have been an increase in myocardial infarctions, which is basically heart attacks, higher blood pressure, stroke, and among those vulnerable people, those people with existing heart disease, there have been studies to show increased hospitalization and mortality related to exposure to particulate matter. And a really great source of information on the health impact of particulate matter is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Integrated Science Assessment. And they review all of the literature on particulate matter and discuss it in a very comprehensive way. Another potential emission is nitrogen oxides. As I discussed before, poultry litter is very rich in nitrogen, but when it's burned, it doesn't stay in the solid part. It's released as a gas into the air. It combines with oxygen to form these oxides. Nitrogen oxides in the ambient air can react with sunlight to create nitric acid, which is a major constituent of acid rain, and it's also a precursor for ozone. The health effects of ozone are primarily related to the respiratory system and include things like wheezing, coughing, asthma attacks, and lung damage. And the United States Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR, has a lot of information on nitrogen oxides on its website, which I have posted here. Arsenic, which is a heavy metal, is another potential emission. Arsenic is used in poultry feed to control intestinal parasites and promote growth. About 70% of chickens in the United States are fed a common arsenic additive. And so any discussion of burning poultry litter needs to really start with what are these poultry being fed, and are they being fed arsenic? There's no safe level of arsenic exposure, and that there are a large variety of low-level health effects. Things like endocrine disruption, which is sort of disrupting the hormones in the body, skin lesions, vascular disease, and certain forms of cancer have all been linked to low-level arsenic exposure. A preliminary analysis done in North Carolina suggested that incinerators would exceed permissible levels that have been set in North Carolina for arsenic exposure. So this isn't a trivial exposure to arsenic. And I will discuss later how the arsenic can then be deposited in the soil and can impact agriculture. Another emission are dioxins. So dioxins result from the incineration of waste. Basically, if you have heat and you have chlorine, you end up with dioxins. They accumulate and persist in both the environment and the human body. And that's important because if a mother is exposed, she can pass it to her child through her breast milk and just through nutrient transport while she is pregnant. Similar to arsenic, there is no safe level of dioxin exposure, and it is characterized by the United States Environmental Protection Agency as a likely carcinogen. Aside from cancer, other health effects related to dioxins have been developmental and behavioral problems in children who were exposed prenatally, and in adults, symptoms of cardiovascular disease as well as diabetes. Those are just some of the emissions. There are others. But now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the potential impacts on agriculture and other impacts on the surrounding communities. So as I said, these emissions can not only impact human health, they can also impact agricultural health. So the emissions from the incinerator can deposit pollutants on nearby farmland, and that includes arsenic and other heavy metals that are emitted during the incineration process. There is some research that suggests that plants can uptake these heavy metals through their roots and then into the crops. Additionally, I talked about how nitrogen oxide can contribute to acid rain, but sulfur dioxide can also contribute to acid rain, and that, as we all know, can negatively affect crops and the soil surrounding the incinerator. Another impact that was brought up by a lot of the North Carolina communities is that it can deter new agricultural businesses from settling in the region. In North Carolina, as well as in Chile, vineyards are a growing agricultural industry, and they may be less likely to start developing in the region if there are concerns about soil contamination. Another concern for surrounding communities is the potential for exposure to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Previous research has found E. coli and other microorganisms present within poultry litter incineration plants. It is possible that these microorganisms could be resistant to antibiotics because of the use of subtherapeutic levels of antibiotics in poultry feed. The use of these antibiotics is mainly for growth as well as prevention of disease in crowded animal operations. The use of these antibiotics has already shown growth of antibiotic-resistant bacteria near industrial poultry operations. And previous research has actually found these strains in flies surrounding industrial poultry operations. So it's not that much of a leap to think that those flies would be near the litter, which could then get transmitted to the communities that are near where the incinerator is located. So there's the potential for both occupational as well as community exposures to these antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And there are other issues to consider, and I don't have the time to go through all of them, but I do want to point them out. That some of the other community exposures are noise. That's 100 trucks coming through your area every day, the smell of the litter, the increased traffic, which can cause stress as well as an increase in accidents and injuries. And other issues of concern are road deterioration and the cost of upkeep, the need for an alternate fertilizer. Right now, poultry litter is used as a fertilizer in many farmlands. And it is sometimes cheaper than some of the chemical-based fertilizers. And also those chemical-based fertilizers have their own environmental impacts that need to be understood. Another issue is that these incinerators require large amounts of poultry litter, so it can lead to greater concentration of industrial poultry operations in the area of the incinerator, which can lead to other environmental impacts. And there's always the potential for the request for burning other fuels. It could be other animal waste, it could be other forms of waste. So that's another thing to consider when you build an extremely large incinerator in a community. So in conclusion, there's very little data on the health effects of this form of technology, but the potential emissions from these plants suggest a wide range of environmental health impacts. The potential benefits related to this renewable energy may be surpassed by the negative consequences to the surrounding communities. And it brings up a larger question of environmental injustice, which is that our rural communities bearing a larger burden of the negative consequences related to energy generation and use. So thank you very much for your time. I have listed a lot of source material and references here, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much for your time.